The cold wind of January 1511 pierced to the bone as the white-haired old man in heavy steel armor climbed the icy extension ladder. His beard, which he had sworn not to shave until the enemy was expelled from Italian lands, fluttered in the wind, mingling with flakes of thick snow. Cannons roared around him, and the air was filled with the rumble of siege engines and the shouts of mercenaries. This man was no ordinary general or audacious condottiere seeking glory on the battlefield. Hidden beneath his helmet was an invisible but palpable power, and on his finger sparkled the fisherman's ring. Before the walls of Mirandola Fortress stood the very vicar of God on earth, Pope Julius II, personally leading the assault on the city. He ignored the advice of cardinals who implored him to remain safely under a canopy, preferring to share the hardships of camp life with his soldiers, warming himself with simple wine and dictating orders directly from the saddle. At this moment, history saw not a shepherd of souls, but a stern monarch, for whom faith was inextricably linked with the sword, and the greatness of the Church with the inviolability of its territorial borders. This scene at the walls of the besieged city became the culmination of the spirit that contemporaries called terrifying, and it was this spirit that defined the entire Renaissance era. To understand how the spiritual leader of the Christian world found himself in the snow-covered trenches of northern Italy, one must look back to the decades preceding his ascent to the throne of St. Peter. The second half of the 15th century was a time when the Apennine Peninsula was a patchwork quilt of warring states, where diplomacy was most often conducted with poison and dagger, and alliances dissolved faster than treaties were signed. Giuliano della Rovere, the future Julius II, grew up in this atmosphere of intrigue, being the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. It was then that he realized that in a world ruled by force and ambition, the Church could not remain merely a spiritual institution. It had to become a state capable of defending itself from the encroachments of both internal tyrants and the great European powers, France and Spain. For many years, Giuliano remained in the shadow of his sworn enemy, Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. The years of exile spent in France only hardened his character and filled his heart with determination to change the fate of Rome. He saw how the wealth and influence of the Church were squandered on the needs of the Borgia family, and he vowed that when his time came, he would restore the Holy See to its former power, transforming it into the center of a new, great empire. Giuliano della Rovere's ascent to the papal throne in October 1503 was one of the swiftest in history. After the brief reign of Pius III, which lasted only 26 days, Giuliano managed to win over almost all the cardinals in a few days, becoming Julius II. He chose this name not only in honor of the ancient Holy Pope, but also as a direct reference to Julius Caesar, whose glory as a conqueror he dreamed of surpassing in a different, sacred capacity. From the very first days of his reign, it became clear that Rome would no longer be the same. The city was suffocating in ruins, the papal treasury was empty, and the outskirts of the papal states were effectively controlled by local despots and the Venetians. Julius II began his work not with prayers or theological disputes, but with an audit of arsenals and the recruitment of new detachments of Swiss guards, who have since become the permanent guardians of the Vatican. His first goal was the return of Perugia and Bologna, key cities that he considered an integral part of the Church lands. The external conflict of this period unfolded against the backdrop of a grand struggle for dominance in Italy. Europe's secular rulers viewed the Italian lands as rich spoils, and Julius II, masterfully exploited their contradictions. In 1508, he initiated the creation of the League of Cambrai, uniting France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire against the powerful Venetian Republic. Venice, calling itself the Mistress of the Seas, dared to appropriate cities in Romagna belonging to the Church. The Pope not only placed the Republic under interdict, excommunicating it from church sacraments, but also personally led a campaign to witness the triumph of his troops. However, as soon as Venice was subdued, Julius II made an abrupt about-face, realizing that the French presence in northern Italy posed a far greater threat. His famous call to expel the barbarians became the motto of the new Holy League, now directed against the French king Louis XII. This was a war not only for territories, but also for the Pope's status as Europe's supreme arbiter, capable of dictating his will to kings and emperors. Behind this large-scale political confrontation lay a deep internal conflict within Giuliano della Rovere himself. All his life, he struggled with the shadow of his predecessors, striving to erase the very memory of the Borgia era. His hatred for Alexander VI was so great that he refused to live in the apartments the latter occupied, stating that he did not wish to see images of his enemy on the walls. Julius II was a man of colossal energy, which contemporaries called terribilità, a mixture of awe-inspiring dread and admiration. His wrath was terrible, and his decisions were lightning fast. However, beneath this mask of a stern warrior lay a man acutely aware of his mortality and striving to leave behind something more lasting than conquered fortresses. He suffered from numerous ailments that worsened during military campaigns, but he continued to move forward, as if driven by an inner flame demanding the completion of the great work of restoring Rome before his earthly journey was over. The Pope's personal relationships with those he chose to implement his plans were full of drama and sparks. The most striking example was his collaboration with Michelangelo Buonarroti. Two titans, possessing equally complex characters, constantly clashed in conflicts that today seem legendary. Julius II saw in Michelangelo not just an artist, but a tool for creating a monumental image of the papacy. When he commissioned the master to create his tomb, it was to be a project of such scale that it would overshadow the mausoleums of ancient emperors. However, military needs and lack of funds constantly interrupted the work, driving the sculptor to despair. Once, in a fit of rage, Michelangelo even fled Rome, offended by the Pope's inattention, and Julius had to use all his influence to bring him back, not even shying away from threats and diplomatic pressure on the Florentine authorities. It was an alliance of coercion and love at the same time, where each recognized the genius of the other but refused to yield an inch of their dignity. The ideological and philosophical conflict of that era lay in the very definition of the Church's role in the changing world of the Renaissance. The clash of humanistic ideals with the harsh reality of political struggle gave rise to paradoxes. On the one hand, Julius II acted as the successor of St. Peter, called to bring peace and salvation. On the other hand, he justified violence as a necessary defense of sacred interests. His concept of the church militant was not merely a metaphor. He believed that only a strong, wealthy, and independent church could fulfill its mission in a world torn apart by the ambitions of secular monarchs. This was a departure from medieval asceticism towards Renaissance grandeur, where the beauty of art and the might of arms served a single purpose: to glorify the divine order through the earthly majesty of its vicar. Philosophers of the time, observing the Pope in armor, questioned, Can blood spilled on the battlefield be consecrated by a tiara? But for Julius himself, the answer was obvious. He saw himself as a restorer of justice, a surgeon who, through pain, restores health to the ailing body of Italy. The transformation of Julius II's perception occurred when he realized that the true immortality of Rome was forged not only by cannons, but also by the sculptor's chisel and the artist's brush. His decision to demolish the old St. Peter's Basilica, which had stood for over 1,000 years, shocked his contemporaries. He was even called a destroyer for daring to lay hands on an ancient sanctuary. But Julius saw in that place not a decaying building, but a colossal cathedral that would become the spiritual center of all humanity. Hiring Donato Bramante, he laid the foundation for a structure whose scale was unparalleled in history. During this same period, he persuaded Michelangelo to abandon sculpture and undertake the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. What began as a project to decorate an interior turned into the greatest revelation in the history of art. For 4 years, lying on scaffolding under the very vault, Michelangelo embodied Julius's vision, the story of creation and the fall of man, which was to remind everyone entering of the Creator's grandeur and the responsibility of the human soul. The culmination of his reign came in the years when all the threads of his politics, military victories, and artistic achievements intertwined into a single knot. In October of 1512, the Sistine Chapel was solemnly unveiled. The Pope, exhausted by illness but unbroken in spirit, entered beneath the vaults, where prophets and sibyls came alive, where the first man reached out his hand to the Creator. It was a moment of triumph of idea over matter. At the same time, his army held positions in key regions, and Rome was transforming into a world capital of the arts, attracting the best minds of Europe. Raphael Santi, during this same period, was painting the Pope's private apartments, the stanze, where the fresco, the School of Athens, embodied the synthesis of ancient wisdom and Christian revelation. Julius II managed to create an atmosphere in which intellectual inquiry did not contradict faith, but complemented it, creating that unique culture we now call the High Renaissance. He proved that power, devoid of aesthetic and ideological content, is ephemeral, whereas monuments of the spirit remain eternal witnesses to human will. However, each triumph carries within it the seeds of future trials. The resonance of Julius II's activities turned out to be far more complex and contradictory than he could have imagined. His methods of governance, which required enormous financial outlays, led to an intensification of the practice of selling indulgences, precisely the phenomenon that, a few years after his demise, would become the detonator of the Reformation. Martin Luther, who visited Rome during Julius's reign, was struck by the luxury and belligerence of the papal court, which strengthened his conviction about the need for radical changes in the Church. The lessons of Julius II's rule are that even the greatest goals, achieved at the cost of compromises with conscience and through violence, leave behind a trail of consequences that cannot be controlled. His desire to protect the Church by transforming it into something resembling a secular monarchy created a deep identity crisis in the Christian world, the consequences of which are felt to this day. Today, the significance of Julius II's figure extends far beyond the historical chronicles of the 16th century. He remains an eternal example of a leader who was not afraid to take responsibility for the fate of his heritage in the darkest of times. His example teaches us that true influence requires not only strength of will, but also the ability to see beyond the horizon of everyday life, investing in what will outlive centuries. We see echoes of him in modern politicians striving for unity and creation through large-scale projects, and in artists, challenging canons for the sake of higher truth. The paradox of the warrior pope is that, striving for earthly dominion, he inadvertently bestowed upon the world treasures that elevate the human spirit above any earthly vanity. His ruthlessness was directed towards creation, and his ambitions towards restoring what he considered a sacred order. In February of 1513, as the life of the great pontiff slowly began to fade, he remained true to himself until the very end. Even on his deathbed, he continued to worry about the fate of Italy and the progress of work on St. Peter's Basilica. His earthly existence came to an end on February 21st, leaving behind a Rome transformed beyond recognition. On his tomb, which was never completed on the scale he dreamed of, stands Michelangelo's figure of Moses. The formidable prophet, with the tablets of the covenant in his hands, seems to be the embodiment of Julius himself, a man who led his people and his church out of chaos, using for this the full might of his wrath and his love. The gaze of this Moses, filled with inner strength and severity, still reminds us of the time when a pope in armor stormed fortresses to erect temples of beauty on their ruins. And when we recall that snowy January at the walls of Mirandola, we understand that it was precisely this cold fire of determination that warmed and illuminated one of the brightest pages of human history, proving that even in the harshest conflict, eternal perfection can be born. Julius II's path was thorny and full of contradictions that defy a simple evaluation. Was he a saint? Probably not, in the traditional understanding of the word. Was he a great statesman and defender of culture? Undoubtedly. His life is a reminder that history is not written by clean hands, but it remembers those who had the courage to leave a deep and meaningful mark on its pages. He transformed Rome from a provincial city into the center of the world, and the papacy, from a toy in the hands of aristocratic clans, into a powerful political and spiritual institution. His legacy lives in every stone of St. Peter's Basilica, in every brushstroke on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and in the very idea that true greatness requires unity of thought, word, and deed. And although the Pope's armor has long been covered with the patina of time, the spirit of his indomitable energy continues to inspire those who believe that even in old age, one can climb ladders towards one's destiny, regardless of the icy wind and blows of fate. This historical narrative compels us to ponder the nature of power and its responsibility towards the future. Julius II did not seek easy paths nor cheap popularity. His dialogue with eternity was conducted in the language of grandiose achievements, where the price of error was oblivion. He understood that a material foundation was essential for the preservation of spiritual authority, and this lesson remains relevant even in our time, when institutions and ideas are constantly tested for resilience. His ability to unite around him the geniuses of his time, such as Raphael, Bramante, and Michelangelo, created a unique precedent of synergy between power and talent, which remains an unattainable ideal for many rulers of subsequent epochs. Concluding our reflection on this colossal figure, we return to the image of a man standing in the cold at the walls of Mirandola. At that moment, he did not know how exactly posterity would remember him, as a tyrant, a warrior, or a patron of the arts. He simply did what he considered his duty, with the passion and dedication of which only chosen natures are capable. His life became a bridge between the fading Middle Ages and the dawn of a new era, a time when the human personality realized its boundless power and its tragic fragility. And in this eternal movement from battle to prayer, from destruction to creation, lies the true drama of human existence, which Julius II embodied with such frightening and captivating fullness. His shadow still falls upon the squares of Rome, reminding us that great deeds demand great sacrifices, and greatness is always the fruit of struggle, in which the sword and the cross are found in the same hands. Ultimately, Julius II left us a world in which beauty became a form of spiritual defense. He proved that art is capable of legitimizing power where laws and treaties are powerless. His cathedrals and frescoes are not merely monuments of luxury. They are manifestos of faith in human capabilities, sanctified by divine presence. And as long as the walls of the Vatican stand, as long as people gaze in admiration at the vaults of the chapel, the voice of this fearsome Pope will resonate in the silence of the centuries, urging us not to fear difficulties and always to strive for what seems impossible. He was a warrior in a tiara not because he loved war, but because he loved the Church and the land he swore to protect. And this love, expressed in stone, paints, and steel armor, remains one of the most powerful testimonies to what a person is capable of when driven by a great purpose. Examining each aspect of his reign in detail, one cannot help but notice how consistently he pursued his goal. Immediately after the capture of Bologna in 1506, he did not merely celebrate victory, but immediately set about reorganizing the city's administration to make it a bulwark of stability for decades to come. His administrative reforms were no less important than his military successes. He created a system that could function even after his departure, understanding that personal charisma is an inexhaustible resource. It was this systematic approach that allowed the Papal States to exist as a unified state until the 19th century. He was a pragmatist to the core, but his pragmatism always served an idealistic goal: the revival of the dignity of the Holy See. Relations with the great powers of the time demanded incredible flexibility and cunning from Julius II. At one moment, he could be an ally of Emperor Maximilian I, and at another, seek support from the Spanish king Ferdinand II of Aragon. His diplomatic correspondence is filled with subtle maneuvers and hidden threats. He masterfully exploited the fear of European monarchs of each other's strengthening to maintain balance in Italy. This was a high-stakes game where the very existence of an independent papacy was on the line. He understood that if Italy became a province of France or Spain, the Pope would turn into a mere chaplain at the court of a powerful king, and it was this fate that he avoided at the cost of incredible effort and constant wars. Julius II's personality is also reflected in his attitude towards his own family. Unlike many of his predecessors and successors, he did not seek to create a dynasty that would rule Rome forever. Although he did promote some of his relatives, this was never prioritized over the interests of the Church. His main family was the institution of the papacy itself. This set him apart from the era of nepotism and personal enrichment. He left the Vatican treasury full, despite enormous expenses on construction and wars, which in itself was a financial miracle of that time. He was as strict with himself as he was with others, leading an almost Spartan lifestyle during campaigns which earned him sincere respect from soldiers. When we look at Raphael's stanza, we see Julius II in various guises, sometimes as a kneeling witness to the miracle at Bolsena, sometimes as a wise legislator. These images were part of carefully crafted propaganda aimed at strengthening the sacred status of the Pope. He understood the power of visual imagery long before the advent of modern mass media. Every fresco, every statue carried a specific message about power, legitimacy, and divine patronage. This was a dialogue with subjects and rivals through aesthetics that allowed no objections. Julius II created a canon for how power should appear, and this canon dominated European culture for centuries. The transformation of Rome under Julius II was physical and tangible. He laid new streets, such as Via Julia, which were meant to become arteries of a new, ordered city. He demolished medieval slums to open up views of ancient monuments, which he deeply respected and sought to preserve. For him, antiquity was not an enemy of Christianity but its foundation, a majestic past that was to be surpassed by an even more majestic present. This concept of the synthesis of eras became the basis of all Renaissance architecture. He saw Rome as an eternal city that must be worthy of its history, and he spared no effort to make this vision a reality. If we talk about human qualities, Julius II was a man of passion. He could not do anything by halves. If he loved, he entrusted the greatest projects. If he hated, it was to the complete annihilation of the enemy's influence. His anger was a cleansing flame that burned out the corruption and laziness that had accumulated in the Vatican corridors. Of course, such straightforwardness created many enemies for him, but it also attracted men of action who were tired of endless intrigues and uncertainty. Even his enemies respected him for his honesty in pursuing his goals. He did not hide behind ambiguous phrases, preferring to speak directly and act decisively. In the twilight of his days, his reflections on the future of the Church took on an even deeper hue. He initiated the convocation of the Fifth Lateran Council in 1512, the goal of which was to reform church morals and prevent schism. Unfortunately, many of his endeavors in this area were not brought to completion by his successors, which led to subsequent upheavals. However, the very attempt at reform from within, without external pressure, speaks to his profound understanding of the problems facing Christianity. He saw the clouds gathering on the horizon and tried to strengthen the edifice of the Church before the storm broke. The legacy of Julius II is a story of how the will of one man can change the course of history for an entire continent. He was an architect not only of buildings, but also of the geopolitical reality of his time. His life teaches us that leadership is, above all, vision and a willingness to go all the way to realize it. He was not a perfect man, but he was the perfect leader for his turbulent and dangerous era. His mistakes were as monumental as his victories, but it is this very scale that makes his figure so appealing to researchers even today. Concluding this overview of the life and work of Julius II, we see before us not just a historical figure, but a living embodiment of the very essence of the Renaissance, an era when man dared to challenge fate and God, striving to create his own world. Julius II, in this sense, was a true son of his time, combining seemingly incompatible qualities. He was a warrior and a builder, a destroyer and a creator, a politician and a mystic. His life is a grand tapestry where the blood of battles mixes with the gold of altars and the azure of the heavens captured on the vaults of the Sistine Chapel. The final chord of his reign was the silence that fell in St. Peter's Basilica after his departure. But this silence was filled with the sounds of the future, the hammering of builders, the rustle of new masters' sketches, and the breath of millions of pilgrims who would come here in future centuries. He laid the foundation of the world we live in today, a world where culture and power are inextricably linked, and greatness is measured not only by the strength of arms, but also by the strength of spirit, embodied in the immortal creations of human genius. Julius II departed, but his Rome remained, eternal, majestic, and terrifyingly beautiful, like the man himself who once climbed a siege ladder in the snows of Mirandola. When we gaze into the features of Moses in the Roman church of San Pietro in Vincoli, we see not just a biblical character. In that intense gaze, in that readiness to rise at any moment and unleash his wrath upon apostates, we recognize Giuliano della Rovere himself. Michelangelo managed to capture the very energy that moved the Pope during his life. This is a monument not only to a man, but to an entire concept of power that tolerates no weakness or mediocrity. Julius II understood that to lead people, one must be a pillar of fire oneself, showing the way in the desert of political and spiritual chaos. His life was precisely such a pillar, scorching and illuminating the path for future generations, reminding us that greatness is a burden that only the bravest can bear. Thus, the story of Julius II is not merely a list of dates and battles, but an epic narrative about the search for meaning in struggle and beauty in destruction. He showed that even the most earthly instruments can serve higher purposes if guided by the hand of a man devoted to his idea. His time was an age of giants, and he rightfully occupied a central place among them, dictating the rhythm of the era with his steps in steel boots across the marble floors of the Vatican. And this rhythm is still audible in the pulse of modern Europe, reminding us of our roots and of the heights that were achieved through the indomitable will of the warrior in a tiara. One would like to believe that the lessons of Julius II will help us better understand the nature of leadership today. In a world where values are often blurred and goals are hazy, the example of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and pursued it no matter what holds a special allure. He teaches us that every great achievement demands its price, and that the true reward for labor is not the praise of contemporaries, but a place in eternity. Julius II earned that place by turning his life into a continuous battle for the greatness of what he believed in. And his victory is the Rome we know and love, a city that has become a symbol of the unshakable human spirit. Ultimately, all our aspirations, like those of Julius II, boil down to one thing: the desire to leave the world a little more ordered and beautiful than it was before our arrival. And though our scale may not compare to that of the warrior Pope, his example reminds us that each of us, in our own place, can be a builder of our cathedral or a defender of our fortress. All that matters is to possess that very terribilità, an inner strength that prevents retreat in the face of difficulties and compels us to move forward, even when the path seems endless and our strength is waning. This is the main secret of Julius II's immortality, a man who transformed his life into the greatest work of art.